Our next session is going to be a panel conversation exploring the future of education in Texas. And I wanted to introduce our moderator for the session, Shari Albright, who's the president of the Charles Butt Foundation. And Shari will also introduce our other panelists. I want to also invite Charles Martinez and Elaine Mendoza to the... Okay.
Well, welcome to the education panel at the 2022 TAMEST Annual Conference. Today we're going to be discussing the future of education in Texas, and we'll also take a look at both the possibilities and the challenges that we're going to be facing. So I'm your moderator. As you heard, I'm Shari Albright. I'm a lifelong educator at the pre-K-12, university level, as well as in the nonprofit arena. And I'm joined by two amazing panelists this morning. They're going to each bring their unique perspectives to what I hope is going to be a robust conversation that we're all going to share. But let me give you a brief short intro of each of them so you know who's from whence they come. So Elaine Mendoza is the founder and president and CEO of Conceptual Mindworks, Inc. And that is a basic and applied research, consulting, and software engineering company housed here in San Antonio. And she leads an entire other life as a leader in our community around educational issues, both at the pre-K-12 level all the way up through higher education. And just for balance on the panel, she is a lifelong Aggie and was on the Board of Regents with Texas A&M, so we are giving fair time up here to two of the systems. Our second panelist is Dr. Charles Martinez, and he serves as the Dean of Education at UT Austin. And he was lured here from the great Northwest just in time during a pandemic to help us weather it. And so we welcome him to Texas and thank him for his leadership. He's a nationally recognized scholar, and his background is about identifying factors that hinder or promote the success of children and families from vulnerable and underserved populations, which you will hear that perspective today on the panel. So we're asked to have a conversation this morning that explores the role of education in building a sustainable and healthy community, and to talk about some of those challenges and opportunities in a growing state like Texas. So we're going to cover a lot of territory today. We're going to kick off with an opening statement from each of us. And as a moderator, I promised to watch our time and leave time for Q&A at the end. So I'm going to push you all through some of our questions and keep us moving along. So I'm going to use my opening statement just to provide some ground setting and some context building for what you're going to hear this morning. So here's just a little set of statistics I'd like to share with you today. So currently, there are almost 5.5 million public school children in the state of Texas. That represents 10% of all school children in the nation. Over 4 million identify as students of color, and of those students, 2.8 million identify as Hispanic or Latino. Currently, over 60% of our students in Texas are identified as economically disadvantaged. Texas students are taught by over 375,000 teachers, certified teachers, in 1,254 school districts across the state of Texas. When we talk about money, Texas ranks 45th out of 50th in the amount of funding that we provide for public education. And the average public teacher salary here in Texas, it lags behind the national average by about $7,500 at this point in time, according to a new report released by the NEA. You heard Secretary Spellings talk a little bit about outcomes. 90.2% of students graduated from high school within the 4 years in this last year. The challenge is that almost 6 percentage points less of graduation occurs on time for economically disadvantaged students. And you can imagine there are disparities if you're a student of color here in Texas. In the fall, almost 50% of our kids went to college, either to a 2 or 4 year public or independent college. And that's down just a little bit due to the pandemic. So finally, I want to share just a couple of survey results from a recent poll that we did in 2022 at my foundation, the Charles Butt Foundation. And we look at Texans' attitudes toward public education each year. And we found that, here's the good news, even in a pandemic, the share of parents who actively have children in school right now are giving their local public schools an A or a B is up 12 percentage points at 68% here in Texas. They give teachers an A or a B at a higher rate, 76%. And, no surprise, teachers are cited as the most trusted to make decisions in the best interest of public school students. They're more trusted than principals, than local school boards, than district administration, and coming in last, elected officials. So, teachers are our trusted ones. So that's the context I wanted to provide, because I wanted you to see that when it comes to talking about schooling and education, it matters in Texas. In education, we succeed or we have challenges on a very big scale. And it deserves all of our attention these days. So with that, on with our panelists. Charles, how about you? Would you give us a little insight on what you're bringing this morning?
I like that you called this an opening statement. It sounds like a soapbox opportunity.
Go for it.
So let me just say a couple things about my background. I'm trained as a psychologist and primarily a prevention scientist. I'm known primarily as a public health researcher, yet I've spent my whole career in colleges of education and inside the education system. There are probably two main reasons for that. The first is a school really represents kind of a marker of the whole social ecology of our environment. This is a place where the action occurs inside our communities. It's really at the level of what occurs in a school building. I bring a very broad lens to that, but I think that's partly why I'm in schools. The second thing is I center equity in a very particular way in the work that I do. And the reality is education is the most essential driver of social mobility and economic vitality. And too often education, both at the K-12 level and in higher education, has served as a gatekeeper rather than a door opener in terms of the pathway to social mobility. Addressing that has been among my most important, passionate charges in my career. I mentioned I think about a school as a venue of the larger environment, and I think that's really important to recognize. Our modern approaches to education have to involve thinking about education in a more holistic way than just kind of that teaching learning dance that occurs between a teacher standing in front of a student with a little light bulb going on above the kid's head. Kids come to school with community assets and vulnerabilities. Things like food insecurity, housing segregation. These are factors that are not controlled by a school but have a direct impact on school. We think in our college and in any world-class college of education about kind of that whole child approach. And I think that means we need public health, we need psychology, we need medical intervention, we need to think much more holistically, and schools are not situated to provide those kinds of services, so that's a big thing on my mind. It's easy to sort of frame the challenges, and I know we're going to talk about some of the challenges, but I want to name that there are also incredible assets inside schools. Schools are a venue of kind of sacred spaces. I do work internationally all over the world, and when I go to a school building, including in places that are among the most challenging social environments in the world, schools that might be surrounded by places where there's a huge amount of violence, and as an example, in those places, schools are always still these sacred places and communities, and that makes schools an asset. Unfortunately, we experience a lot of challenges with this, and the recent shooting in Uvalde is another example of a threat against schools as this sacred place. But I think that idea, harnessing those assets about what schools mean to communities, becomes a really important lever for change. The final thing I'll mention in just this opening volley, and my dear friend Margaret Spellings alluded to this, we had a great question about the point of universities redirecting our work to thinking about how to be in communities. I have always lived with one foot in the academy and one foot out in the world. That's how I've done my entire career, and I feel like I'm a heretic inside the academy. ultimately, if we're going to make any difference at a community level, it requires us to engage in authentic research practice partnerships to not just deliver evidence base and hope that our communities use it with fidelity, but instead listening to what communities might need from places like UT Austin and from Texas A&M and other world-class institutions so that we can better address the needs of communities. I think one of our major failures, perhaps as a field, is not the development of an evidence-based. We know a lot about what works to make a difference for students in schools, for families, for teachers, and communities. What we're not good at is ensuring that those evidence-based practices have any stickiness beyond the length of a grant. And as a NIH and Department of Education funded researcher, I think in grant cycles too. But our question has to be, what do we leave behind in those communities? And I think that may be among the biggest challenges we face.
Thank you. Elaine, will you share with us how does this business leader become this fervent supporter and warrior about education?
Thank you, Dr. Albright. Good morning, everyone. And first of all, if I may, congratulate our great Texas A&M faculty and researchers on their awards this last couple of days. And of course, to Dr. Junkins, his award as well. We go way back. He was my professor of orbital mechanics back when we were using chisels and stones, so it was good. But certainly deserving of the award. To answer your question, Dr. Albright, and it parallels what Dr. Martinez says, education is the great equalizer. It is the vehicle of economic mobility. That's what my parents did. They put themselves through school while we were growing up. As such, it changed the economic conditions of our family in one generation. The grandmother's house I went to is light years away from the grandmother's house my daughters went to. So that's it. Education, one generation in America. It also, though, excites civic engagement. The more educated the populace is, the more educated they are, the more engaged they are in all sorts of voting and participation in the arts and all the good stuff that societies need to thrive. Furthermore, though, and you all know this probably a lot better than I, but the more educated you are, the healthier you are, regardless of economics. That's just the way it is. That's what the data show. In particular to this group, I had the great opportunity to chair a congressional commission on the advancement of women, minorities in science, engineering, and technology. It was sponsored by the National Science Foundation back in 1999 to the year 2001. So at the time, y'all remember, it was a dot-com boom. There weren't enough technical folks to fill the slots. Kind of reminiscent of today. And the challenge of this commission was to see if we could engage more underrepresented groups in science and engineering and technology. Could we fill this workforce shortage? And so off we went to study this. Our charge was to figure out how we get high schoolers interested in science, engineering, and technology, and what do they need to be prepared to move forward? Well, we started there. Said, okay, well, how do they get into calculus in high school? Well, you don't take Algebra 1, as Dr. Spelling said. In 8th grade, you're going to be behind. All right, well, why aren't they taking Algebra 1 in the 8th grade? Well, a lot of our 5th graders are leaving elementary school with a disdain for mathematics. Well, and not to mention the data showed that it starts to split right there. The haves and the have-nots start to split in terms of their attainment of math and science concepts. Well, what's going on in elementary school? Well, I think, Mary Pat, you may have articulated this better than I. Our EC6 educators have to teach everything. And if one of those teachers is shy about math or just kind of grumbles about teaching math, right then and there, we've lost some of our students. Okay, well, how can we make sure that when they enter elementary school, they're ready for the rigor and they're interested in math and science? Well, you got to go to pre-K. 0 to 5, the most formidable years we're missing a huge opportunity to teach concepts of math and science, to insert into the vernacular engineering concepts and science concepts. Let them say the words. So our commission that started off trying to figure out how to fill the workforce needs couldn't fill our report out with credibility unless we talked about the education continuum, starting, quite frankly, with prenatal care and moving through the whole thing. And oh, by the way, access to health care from prenatal care all the way through the continuum is essential. Again, Mary Pat, how do we make sure that our youngest of the young can see, can hear, can attend school because of asthma problems that aren't resolved? How do we ensure that they are mentally prepared and engaged and stimulated so that they will continue on by having the access to health care that they need? So this is much a parallel to, let's say, software development or manufacturing approach. We all know, and I don't mean this negatively, we all know the earlier you find a bug in your code, the better off the quality will come out on the other end. We all know that the earlier you find defects in your manufacturing process, the better off it's going to come out on the other end of the line. We all know you don't want your customers finding the discrepancy in your products or your services. That's just it. The same is true here. If higher education wants the product to come out that they have to work with, we all know the most cost-efficient way to graduate, to shorten time to degree, to have persistence of our students in higher ed, is to make sure they come as prepared as possible for the rigor of higher education. And if we don't care about our supply chain, if we don't care about the quality of our students coming in and the access to education they have starting from the very earliest of years, we are missing an opportunity to work out those kinks and to ensure that they, when they hit our doors, whether it's certificates, associate's degrees, baccalaureate degrees, we've missed an opportunity. The economy is about innovation. It always has been, it always will be. Whether you call it the knowledge account, whatever, we all know that the things our kindergartners are learning today and the fields that they're looking at today won't be the things that they actually go into, because there's going to be new stuff out there. So we have to remember this is an education continuum, and this is the heart and soul of our social and economic engagement. And quite frankly, so goes some of the underrepresented groups in Texas, so goes Texas, and we all know, so goes Texas, so goes the United States. And Dr. Albright, that's why I spend my volunteer time trying to learn more and help in education.
And I am grateful that I get to work with her on multiple community engagements, which you can see why she's such a passionate advocate. So I want to turn us a little bit. We're going to do speed round of questions so that we have time for Q&A. Let's go and delve into, you talked about healthcare, let's talk about COVID. What have you all seen are the impacts of COVID on education, maybe both good and bad? And are there some seminal lessons, bright spots we might take forward in how we've approached it? Charles, can I turn to you?
And this is a speed round. How do we talk about COVID impacts in the speed round?
It's the 800-pound gorilla.
One of the things that I'll just put in the room with us, a lot of what we've learned in the education system related to the after effects of COVID-19 really have to do with sort of exacerbating long-standing challenges inside the system rather than creating new ones. I think we're much more tuned into the effects of COVID, but in many ways what they've done is largely shown a light on what have been long-standing persistent challenges in the system. So an example might be the learning. We've had a lot of conversations the last 2 years about learning loss, although we talk about it more as the need to accelerate learning, because the premise that all kids are behind is not a fair appraisal of the situation. Accelerated learning has always been a challenge because it requires teachers to engage in skills that require them to differentiate instruction. Kids' starting place is variant, and how are teachers supported to address the variation in where kids start to ensure that they have a year's worth of learning. COVID has shown a much sharper light on that variability, because entering classrooms in the fall of 2020 and now through this year and into next year, is much more variance. Some kids who have managed to endure with a lot of supports, pods and other things that got created during COVID, partly because of economic advantage, have not had nearly as much challenges as in terms of their learning as kids that might have been disengaged. And we have millions of kids all over the country who were disengaged from school during the entire period of the pandemic. So that variance has, I think, been a huge challenge. Pandemic has required us to think much more about the whole child. The social-emotional learning needs of students, which has always been sort of a side activity of schools, has now been much more in the center of what teachers have to navigate. How do we ensure that kids have the supports they need to respond to their worry, their stress, their anxiety, their emotional health in order to create the conditions in which learning can happen? That's been brought into much sharper focus. The use of educational technology, it's as if that didn't exist before COVID, but this has been a challenge for a really long time.
Yeah.
How we utilize and employ at scale high quality technology to advance learning, and how we address some of the sources of inequity around access to technology. COVID has certainly showed us where those inequities exist. What happened in the big cities in Texas during COVID and in terms of technology was very different than what happened, for example, in Deep East Texas, in Lufkin, Jasper, and those areas, where the school might be the only place where there's a weak internet signal at all. So where are kids accessing internet to even do Zoom sessions? So these to me are some of the major examples. The last thing I'll mention here is around the family-school partnership. You probably saw during that first 6 months of the pandemic how many parents were like on social media saying, I now appreciate what teachers do. Because they were having to fill in a void that they were unprepared to recognize all the things that teachers do. Teachers should be paid $1 million. I saw 1 billion tweets like this, and you probably have your own experiences in this realm. What happened for schools is that schools lost their kids. And I heard from lots of leaders in Texas who said, we don't know where our kids are. And I found it kind of understandable, kind of a puzzling question, because I'm like, well, I know where they are. And they go, really? Tell me. I said, well, they're at home. The problem isn't that the kids didn't disappear. The problem is that our superficial approaches to family-school partnerships did not lend themselves to being activated at a time when it really mattered. We don't pay nearly enough attention to strengthening those true partnerships between teachers and parents. They're not in sync around the instructional enterprise, around their common expectations for students, and because of that, when it was challenged, we all suffered. And so I think the idea of creating much stronger ties between communities, families, and schools has become much more prescient because of the pandemic.
Absolutely. Elaine, I'm going to turn to you, and you and I both worry about pre-K because we're on the municipal board that oversees pre-K for SA, and we lost a bunch of kids because they just didn't enroll. What all did you see happening during the pandemic?
Well, of course, echo what Dr. Martinez has already said and what you just pointed out, Dr. Albright. I would say that, though, the positive side was that it really pronounced the importance of the schoolhouse.
Yeah.
It really showed how important the schoolhouses are to our communities. It also highlighted the great need for mental health care and how it should be on par with dental care and with health care. It really just shone a big old light on that, and that is a positive thing that we can take forward. The other aspect, Shari, going back to pre-K, is it really showed the economic dependence on child care centers, which worked well, worked right. They are early childhood education centers. And that's one thing, Shari, that we're working on in pre-K for SA is helping our child care centers move forward with quality, move forward with curriculum, move forward with the educational aspects of the children that they have, that the parents entrust to their facility, so that both parents can go to work if they so choose. That's a huge opportunity. Folks could not go to work, even if they were frontline workers, because of lack of child care. So that really shone a light. But taking advantage of that light and then moving our child care centers to early childhood development centers is a huge opportunity. And then we can begin at the beginning in shaping our young people for success. So those would be the aspects of COVID that
100%.
looking at it a positive.
Well, and so much of what Charles, both you and Elaine talked about too is centers around teachers and what's happening in those schools. And you know, we're at a real inflection point here in the state of Texas. It's not a new problem. We've been watching it creep up on us with kind of a retirement bubble coming, but we have a teacher workforce, I would say, crisis at this point in time. For example, in our latest poll that we did of teachers across the state, 77% of teachers said that they have actively considered leaving the profession this year. And of those 77%, 72% have taken concrete actions to look for other work, with over half of that work being outside of education. We have 375,000 teachers that we need to be worrying about. Charles, what do you I know this is something you've delved deeply into.
Yeah, I think you fairly describe this as a crisis. The only nuance here is that the crisis has been there for a long time. Texas sheds about 10% of that workforce every year. So we're talking about 35,000 or more teachers on an average year, a trip. And it's fascinating. When I came here as dean, we have among the best retention rates in Texas from our College of Ed. We should be. We're world class. We do things that very few institutions can do, and we're really proud of that. We retain more in 5 years than our peers, teachers who stay in their profession. And I was sort of like, well, this is sort of a peculiar thing for me. What dean of a College of Engineering would say, hey, isn't this good news? 80% of our graduates are still engineers 5 years later. That wouldn't sound like good news, would it? But somehow that's the narrative that we've created around teachers. We've accepted an attrition rate that should be completely unacceptable. We lose lots of teachers in those first few years for a variety of reasons. The effect on Texas is that the institutions of higher education cannot meet that demand and have the quality that we aspire to. So they don't meet the demand, they hold the line on quality, and we certainly do that too. So what's happened in Texas is that we've had the proliferation of alternative certification, non-institutions of higher ed based certification. You've probably seen billboards like, want to be a teacher? Give us a call. We can get you in a classroom right now. And there are ways to actually use loopholes in the system to enter the classroom if you have a bachelor's degree with no experience teaching whatsoever. More than half of the teachers in Texas who are hired come from alternative certification. Some of those alternative certification programs are amazing. In fact, we just completed a study that looked at these different routes, and it did not tell one story. It's not like all institutions of higher ed are great and all alternative certification is terrible. That's not a fair appraisal. But too many of them produce teachers that either do not get hired or do not do good work or leave the profession prematurely. We are unlike every other state in the country. Nobody is like us in this state. We have almost a warm bodies in classroom approach to teachers. The core of the problem here is about devaluing teachers. The shortage we're talking about this coming year is more like 45,000 new teachers. That will be the storyline later this summer and fall when the data actually emerge in terms of the attrition we've seen in the educator workforce. What would happen if this were a physician shortage, and you all understand this, we would be rallying every resource in Texas to respond to it, wouldn't we? We'd be providing financial aid, scholarships, we'd make medical education free, the salaries would inherently go up because of demand. All the natural things would occur if this were a physician shortage. Instead, we're responding in other than hand-wringing, we're really not responding. If I pulled someone off the street and handed them a scalpel and stethoscope and said, go treat a patient, you'd find that absurd. But we've effectively pulled people off the street, handed them a piece of chalk or a dry erase marker and said, go teach. That comes from a devaluing what teachers do that runs to the core of this state in a very particular way. Coming from the West Coast, there's devaluing of teachers everywhere, but there's a particular brand of it in Texas that we have to figure out collectively. There's no more important work that occurs, I often say at UT, other than Dell Medical School, there's only one other place that really is fundamentally about transforming lives, and it happens in the College of Education. And whether you think about education the way that I do, you know, we don't make more Nobel Prize winners, we don't have a vibrant STEM pathway without what happens in K-12. So it all starts there, and you heard that from Elaine. There's nothing more urgent for this state than this crisis that has now become a catastrophe.
And Elaine, you took on teacher prep when you were the chair of the Board of Regents at A&M. Can you just talk a little bit about the work that happens system-wide there?
Sure, thank you. You know, actually, let's rewind just a little bit. It actually started, I happened to have the opportunity to chair the Committee on Student Success there on the board. And that's where we started back in 2011, 2012, looking at this whole problem. We had to articulate why it's so important for higher ed to be involved in pre-K-12. And we went out actually to Toyota manufacturing here. One of the things that I learned from a colleague who is a supplier to this Toyota plant is he said the difference between the American auto manufacturers, the head, GM, et cetera, and the Toyota group is they find issues with their supply chain, they will send their best and brightest from Toyota to go help your supplier fix it. It's not about penalizing you, saying drive your costs down, drive your costs down. It was more typical American side. It is about how do we help you solve your problem. That's very analogous, as I said earlier, to higher ed. How can we help pre-K-12 with their situation? And the one clear intersection is that we graduate all the teachers. We produce the teachers, we produce the administrators, principals, superintendents, if you will. So therein lies the criticality of educator preparation, not to mention how important teachers are, how incredibly, how much impact they have. Okay, I'm biased. My mother was a lifelong educator. Elementary school, retired as an elementary school principal. I don't even know how many lives she changed over her 52-year career. How many lives were impacted? Educators like Shari and all those educators in the classroom, think about how many lives they have impacted positively. They are. They are the most important thing that we could possibly do. So we did. At the A&M system, we have 11 colleges of education in our system, from Canyon, Texas, West Texas A&M, up in the Panhandle, all the way to Laredo, Texas A&M International, and all points in between. We do serve the underserved, and it's very, very important that we take students from our rural communities, from our minority communities, from the male population to enter our colleges of education. Our system as a whole produces the greatest numbers of educators in the state. Just a few hundred more than the UT system, but
oh, we're going to go there.
Little alligator, it's greater than. So this is a huge responsibility. This is a huge responsibility. So back in about 2013, we embarked on this systemic effort to not only raise the visibility of our colleges of education, because as Dr. Martinez says, you know, you hear a lot about engineering and agriculture and business. You don't hear a lot about the colleges of education. And at the time, our Dean of the College of Engineering, Dr. Banks, who's now president of the university, she embarked on a 25 by 25 plan, 25,000 engineers by the year 2025. She could not do that if we don't have the best and the brightest teachers in those classrooms. It's just so logical. It makes systemic sense. So we challenged all of our deans. They come together now. We started in 2013. Now they continue to do this, looking for ways to increase the effectiveness of how they recruit. I wish we were a country that called our teachers nation builders, as we learned in Singapore, right, Dr. Albright? In Singapore, they call their teachers nation builders. Isn't that appropriate and beautiful? But we're not there. We need to market that. We need to begin to talk about teachers as they should be talked about, nation builders, cultivators of our economic engines. So we embarked on that. We also embarked on how do we make sure that, at the time it was EC6, I know now it's EC3, EC6 teachers are prepared to teach all those subjects. So at A&M, we actually added a certificate for teaching math in EC6. We also added a certificate back in 14 or 15, believe it or not, in virtual environments, teaching virtual environments. Most of those are now infused in the curriculum. But back then, that's what we did, because we took the responsibility that we have to pre-K-12 and, quite frankly, as the land grant, to ensure that we are producing the best teachers possible. You never heard of a college of education coming before the Board of Regents and presenting their work, presenting what they're doing as 11 colleges collaboratively together before that time. They are on equal footing with our agriculture and engineering and business schools and all those liberal arts, etc., because they are that important. So we are actually also encouraging them to work together on research. You don't have an NIH for education. You need it. Wow. So how do we take those precious few dollars and collaborate and work together? That's been one of our assignments as well. So that's our focus, Shari, is to take those 11 colleges and highlight them, demonstrate their importance, give them the tools and technology and the evaluation, as you all are doing for us, that they need to get better, and challenge them on the recruiting front. Not having the colleges of education, this is an awful thing to say, as a college of last resort. No. It should be the college of first choice if you want to impact lives and make a difference.
Thank you. As a former teacher, thank you. We have many more questions we would love to touch on, and we know that we're reaching the end. We would be remiss if we didn't recognize the fact that 80 miles from here, the situation, the crisis, and the tragedy in Uvalde occurred. And we lost 19 children and 2 teachers in that awful, awful shooting that happened there. There are lots of us that are rallying around, both in the state and nationwide, to think about rebuilding that community and providing support to that community. And lots of people, we're talking about rebuilding the school. And I'm super concerned about what happens in that school when it reopens. How does it become a place of hope and healing for that entire community? I'm just going to ask Charles, because we're very short on time. I would wonder, with your background, Charles, would you just say a few words about what you think is absolutely essential that we be thinking about in those kinds of processes?
Yeah, thank you for that question. This is a really important topic. And it harkens back to this thing I mentioned around research and practice. In these moments of pain, we often end up focusing on something to soothe our immediate concern. And the idea of raising the building and starting fresh has this sort of symbolic power. And it's completely understandable to imagine what that building evokes for parents and kids and teachers. So this is not an unreasonable thing. The issue is like building the school versus rebuilding the school versus rebuilding the community.
Exactly.
Schools matter because of what they mean to communities. I was in a school in Central America in a very isolated part of Honduras, and I went to the school building, and we had a tour by a 6-year-old student at the school, came on a Sunday along with a 20-year-old teacher to talk to us about the school and the community. And you got to know that this building was on this gorgeous white sand beach with crystal turquoise water, but it was hot. And we're in this building, there's no electricity. The only source of power was a battery and 2 little charges. There was not a single book in the school building. There was no chairs for students. It was cinder block. I stood in this building and I was overwhelmed by how teaching and learning happens there. Plus, it was really hot. I'm in this building, I'm just pouring sweat. And I asked the question that might have emerged to many of us, so I looked outside and I see this gorgeous sand and the trees swaying, and I'm like, well, why would you have school here in this building? And the teacher stared at me for, I'm gonna guess, 45 seconds. It was quite awkward because she didn't understand the question. She finally said, this is our school. This is where kids learn. They built that cinder block building with their hands. It wasn't the structure, it wasn't the fact that it had electricity or not, or that there was no books or even chairs. Its power was in a sense of community, and I think we can forget that that's where the rebuilding starts, not the physical structures. We lose sight in our grief of the evidence base. You know, we talk because of the hurt about quick maneuvers, you know, around how we fix the problem. We're of course doing a lot of finger pointing right now. As someone who works in the area of violence prevention, there are things we know a lot about and some things we don't know a lot about. A lot of our efforts around school hardening are examples of things we actually know something about, and more barbed wires, more security, those don't tend to increment safety. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can do around these, locked doors, other things that are problems, but sometimes our instincts are misaligned with the evidence base, and my hope is that we think about what it means to rebuild community, and that we better borrow from what is an expansive evidence base rather than just do what feels immediate or sometimes politically expedient in a situation of this much hurt in a community.
And I hope we'll think about an expansive version of recentering the school in the community as a place that others that can come to for that healing and hope as well. I think there are great models out there that we could turn to that we just have not stepped into that space yet in thinking post this tragedy. So thank you for that. We would love to end with a really happy note, but I also want to leave time for a question or two. Please know that we all are hopeful up here about the power of education, but what questions do you all have that you might want to bring forward to this panel?
I'm John Jenkins. Thank you. Great panel. I think there are several ingredients that are difficult to wrap into a short question, but how do we generate a generation of Elaine Mendoza's? The passion is really important in education. I think Elaine and I have more in common than we shared a classroom at one time. We both had parents, excuse my voice, seem to be disappearing today, but we both had parents who truly valued education, and it stuck. If you go back a generation before Elaine to my generation, I'm perhaps an example of something that I think, Charles, that you were on to. The cultural value of education is very kind of family specific sometimes. I'm the first Ph.D. from my county. My parents were, the well-educated parent had the 6th grade education. 5 children all finished university and advanced degrees. And although I'm in the National Academy, I'm not the most successful member of my family. I have a sister who's in the Literary Hall of Fame. So where did that come from? That came from a family that really got it, that education was a ticket. And it came in spite of the fact in a rural, mountainous area of North Georgia, we had some great teachers. And it was really more about attitude than the specifics of the curriculum. So how do we do that? I think that's where the kernel is of trying to address this problem. Some of it is societal and a totally orthogonal observation. As our nation has evolved and we have exported the first 2 or 3 rounds on the ladder out of poverty. My parents were both in the textile industry of North Georgia and South Carolina and those environs, which has all been exported. Replacing the same dollar value of income with income transfer is not the same as that money being earned and the family developing a work ethic and appreciation that, hey, the next generation, you can do better through education. So there's a number of issues here, and so it really burdens K-12 more because of a lot of the ingredients of my, even though I was impoverished financially, I was rich because we had a very, very strong North, new appreciation of where true North was, and those things are really fundamental to producing an Elaine.
Charles, did
So,
you
yeah, this is a really important point. I'm curious how many others might be the first in their family to go into college and graduated. Okay, so there are a few of us in this room, and you know, I often name this thing. It's really important to recognize what it means to be first. I mean, you talked about this in your family story. My son just graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering and aerospace. He's not a first gen, his dad is. And I often remind our students that if you're a first gen college student, you're also the last first gen in your family. And that's really emotional for me to say out loud because we forever change the trajectory of our family when you break through. I am very aware, even in the 25-year career I've had in higher education, that this place that I occupy is not made for people like me. I'm Latino, with immigrant grandparents and a first-gen college student. There is still secret knowledge in higher education for which I have no access. That's bizarre given my career, and yet that's still true. It's important to name that. And I think you really skillfully laid a foundation for things that we know. Shari mentioned at the beginning, the high school graduation rates in Texas are strong. Our college touch rate is also strong. But it's important to recognize that our college completion rates are terrible. And they are disparate by economic group and by race and ethnic group. If you're a Latino kid in poverty, your likelihood of getting an AA degree or a four-year degree lags substantially behind, multiple decimal places behind your peers. That's important to name. I have projects right now that are designed to build this pathway. It was alluded to earlier that the pathway starts really early. You don't make a college graduate or a math major or a STEM major by recruiting a freshman college student. You make them by recruiting a fourth and fifth grader.
Hear, hear.
That's where it starts. And you have to build this mindset along the way for students to find themselves in college. As a first-gen student, if my dad were here, he just passed away a few months ago, he would tell you, my son's a self-made man. Well, no, that's not right. I'm not a self-made man. You had a lot to do with my success because he taught me I could do anything. He gave me confidence even when I shouldn't have had it. That was a buffer. He sees me as an exception to a rule. The way we're working on this problem is we think about family academic identity. This is the heart of the matter for you. If you're not first gen, it's often because your family said, college isn't for us. If you're first gen like me, what you were told was you were the exception to the rule. My dad literally believes that something courses through my veins in my DNA. I captured something on the Bonilla side of my family that made me somehow college bound. As opposed to the real truth, which is that it's a big lie that college is for some and not others.
Amen.
The breakthrough is when families see a shared identity, that if only for not having an opportunity, we could have done it too, son, daughter, and you will. That's a different take than my dad's take. And I think that's what we need to build inside the machinery.
I know that we are at time. I'm so sorry. I know you all are standing here, but we are getting the cue that it is beyond our time, so my apologies that we can't do any further. Thank you so much, though, for letting us be a part of your day today. Thank you to our panelists.
I want to thank our distinguished